Okay, welcome back. So I know this is an anticipated session for many of you. We will be focusing on where climate and where environmentalism and the economy intersect. So we have a number of experts here for you. Our last speaker, Cesar Jung-Harada, will be joining us. He is just a little bit delayed, but he will be here in time to answer your questions. So I'll start with Mr. Lim. Lim Tuang Liang is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Singapore's Ministry of Sustainability and Environment. He focuses on sustainability partnerships with public sector agencies. Mr. Syed Mubarak is the Government Affairs Chair, and hold on because this is a bit of a mouthful, for the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. However, he has a 30-year career in sustainability and technology, specifically helping businesses with ESG frameworks. Then we have Aurel Moise, who is substituting Kanhu, who is on the agenda, I think, that you have printed out. He is the Senior Principal Research Scientist and Deputy Director of the Center for Climate Research in Singapore. He works on climate change projections and oversees the National Sea Level Program. And prior to that, he spent 15 years at the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. So he's published a number of works on climate extremes, climate teleconnections, and the like. And then Cesar, who will be joining us, is a professor at the Singapore Institute for Technology, and he's a designer. He's done numerous TED Talks, as well as spoken at the UN and Harvard, and his focus is primarily ocean technologies and innovations. So if you noticed on our agenda today, we're ending the day with a field trip to Marina Barrage and their sustainability gallery. So from all of these panelists, there may be some questions there that you'd like to ask about water and that kind of management. So we're very excited to have these four. They will speak, all four will speak, and then we will open it up to questions. And please, when you ask your questions, if you're directing it to a specific panelist, let us know. Please join me in welcoming them. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I think that I'll allow me to start the panel. Hi, I'm Tuang Liang, Lim Tuang Liang. I'm the Singapore government's first government chief sustainability officer. Started work in this assignment since the 1st of January this year. And I'm very excited and pleased to be here with you, sharing some perspectives, and maybe also having the opportunity to learn from all of you as well. Maybe I'll just start off with a brief explanation of what I do, but then I also have spent some time talking about the Singapore government's focus on sustainability, and then subsequently we'll just end there, and then we'll leave the floor open for panel discussions later. The government chief sustainability officer, who I am, is responsible for really three main segments of our sustainability strategy. The first is in terms of coordinating the public sector efforts in driving a much more sustainable island. And we do this through the Singapore Green Plan, which was developed with 5 ministries: Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Ministry of National Development, as well as the Ministry of Education. In that, we had developed a plan which was announced 2 years ago, in which there were 5 main pillars, which helped us to coordinate many of the actions that we need to take as a whole of government to affect many different aspects of Singapore society. These 5 main pillars, and I'll go through them one by one. The first is the city in nature, in which we endeavor to be able to provide greater access to greenery and biodiversity for Singapore citizens. This we do through increasing the number of trees that we're planting, increasing or actually shortening the access to green spaces for our citizens. And really also to be able to improve the biodiversity habitats for many of the various flora and fauna in Singapore. The next pillar is on the energy reset, which is essentially how we will try to green our grid. And we green this through four main strategies or four switches. The first is to continue to use and harness natural gas as our fossil fuel, as a low carbon fossil fuel, but to be able to then also implement technologies from carbon capture perspective as part of the transition strategy. The second switch is in terms of using solar energy in Singapore. Even though it seems very sunny in Singapore, however, it's also limited in terms of space, in terms of irradiance. You see clouds, you see cloud cover, rain, and so on and so forth. And it's been estimated that about 10% of our energy needs could be generated through solar power. The rest are renewables, unfortunately. Being where we are today, we don't have very strong winds, we don't have very, very strong currents. We're not able to harness those. Although we are also putting in efforts to look at alternative forms of energy as well, which I'll come to as a fourth switch. The third switch then is one in which we are trying to import renewable energies from our region, connecting within ASEAN, and subsequently also connecting with other partners outside ASEAN in terms of opportunities in which they have from renewable energy sources to be able to then import either green electrons or green molecules onto our island. And then last but not least, the fourth switch is really about advanced technologies that we continue to look at and monitor and really prepare ourselves in the energy transition. This comes in the form of new energy sources, such as from hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, even geothermal. And I think that sometime last week, I think some of scientists completed an initial study in assessing the geothermal potential in Singapore to be able to deal or be able to leverage on new technologies, advanced geothermal technologies that can hold some initial and interesting promise as a source of renewable energy for Singapore. So that is the second pillar. The third pillar is really about sustainable living, in which our environment agencies, our water agencies work very closely with Singapore citizens to look at how we transform the lifestyles of our citizens and even the practices of industries to be a lot more efficient in terms of the way that they manage water, they minimize waste, and even in transportation, they to be able to provide the public transport infrastructure to allow all our citizens to be able to primarily take public transport to their work and their everyday lives, rather than use much more carbon-intensive alternatives in terms of transportation and mobility. The next pillar we have really is about resilient future. And resilient future is where we are looking at how we are adapting and preparing the country in terms of dealing with the challenges of climate change. This comes in the form of sea level rise in terms of extreme weather, be it in rain or even extreme temperatures in heat. And this is something that perhaps later Aurel will be able to elaborate on, since he's the meteorological expert here on the panel. But essentially, we are putting in a lot of efforts in terms of actually working with PUB, which is our water agency, but given the responsibility also in terms of coastal protection, to armor 200 kilometers of our coastline. And working with the national development agencies to also look at how we are designing and transforming our urban landscape, such that we address issues such as new designs, new materials, new cooling systems, so that we can address not just the temperature rise, the ambient temperature rise, but also the urban heat island effect. And that is something that perhaps is unique to more urbanized cities, but it's something that actually is very important for Singapore. And particularly for Singapore being an island state, is that we live in an environment which is relatively high humidity. So again, not just temperature rise, but also the high humidity would affect the way that we are able to operate in an outdoor environment. So that's something that we're keenly aware of as well. And last but not least is the final pillar, which is green economy. Looking at how our society, our economic structures transform, we're also seeing and preparing our citizens and industries to be able to be more sustainable, but also take advantage of the opportunities that the global economy will present as more and more companies and sources of finance, for example, start to shift towards allocating resources, opportunities, business to companies that are able to produce more sustainable products and services. So these are really the 5 pillars as part of the Singapore Green Plan that we have put together, and we'll continue to make rapid progress. The Green Plan concludes, at least in the initial conclusion is about at 2030, where we have all put down our quantifiable targets. And this is something that my office works with agencies to keep track of, to understand the progress and to be able to also address any levels of friction that we encounter in order to really deliver the Green Plan. The other aspect that we do is, of course, we've also announced our net zero ambitions. Singapore's net zero ambition, net zero by 2050. For the government, we have accelerated that to 2045. Around 2045 is when we want to be able to reach net zero. And in doing so, through this acceleration, we move agencies a lot faster than the rest of the island, and with the intent to really understand where are the challenges in terms of shifting energy sources, changing practices, and so on and so forth. And with that, if these challenges also encounter friction, and sometimes these can take the form of regulations that will optimize or design for a different world, that we would then be able to then understand these, work with agencies to be able to resolve and really remove these levels of friction. And in doing so, pave the way for the rest of Singapore society to adopt a much more sustainable lifestyle. So that is really essentially what we do, coordinating with the government. Of course, I can speak a little bit more about what we do with the community, but I'll leave it to the panel discussion as well. So really, besides the internal coordination, what Singapore does is also about external collaboration. And through that, we really look at 3 big pieces of convening, of really connecting, and also collaborating. In convening, we bring together, we organize many different forums, discussions, such as the Singapore International Water Week, the World City Summit. We have corporate partners such as Temasek that organize Ecosperity Week, in which we really bring many thought leaders into Singapore to convene these discussions where we're able to share perspectives, ideas, learn the lessons in terms of policy implementation with each other, and in doing so, really help to engender a much more globalized conversation as part of the sustainability agenda. The other thing that we do in terms of connection is obviously these ideas need to land, and earlier I mentioned about connecting even for us in terms of the grid. We work very closely to look at, to operationalize the vision of the ASEAN grid, in which the ASEAN grids are connected so that we are able to share resources to be able to trade renewable electricity, and in doing so allow us to leverage on the strengths of different countries and overcome the weaknesses of others to be able to then provide a means in which electricity then can be much more greener. And of course, finally, in terms of collaboration, we work very closely country to country, for example, bilateral collaboration with countries such as Ghana. We've worked with Ghana to look at carbon credits and to be able to recognize the carbon credits in accordance with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And in doing so, allow companies to then trade or purchase carbon credits that are of high quality. With businesses, of course, we also collaborate. For example, the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization is something that the MPA, or the Maritime Port Authority, together with 6 industry partners, have come together putting in money, resources, expertise to really generate ideas and develop technologies, try and test out some of the technologies that will help the maritime sector decarbonize in terms of new fuels, new ship designs, and so on and so forth. And we do so because we are a maritime nation, small island, but really deeply connected to the rest of the world. The maritime sector is an important part of our economy, and where we can, we work with businesses to be able to then collaborate towards a greener outcome. So I think that I spoke about coordination and collaboration. I think that the last point I'd like to raise is really about context. The context of Asia and Asia's journey in sustainability is a very important one. All of our countries are differentiated in terms of geography, in terms of capabilities, economies, and peoples and culture. And I think that these differentiated paths require us to have a deep understanding of mutual challenges, so that then we can come to a good consensus, a good way to be able to look at opportunities for collaboration. And really, all of you in this room represent that context. You come from all different walks, different parts of Asia, and it really, really is very encouraging that all of you are here today. And I look forward to the sharing with you, and also to learn and hear from some of the perspectives that you have as well. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lim. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know Anne told me that you guys are more interested in trade and how climate change can impact trade or vice versa, right? So myself, Syed Mubarak, I'm in the ESG sustainability space for 3 decades. Most of the time I spend my life on a corporate. So where I help corporates to meet the compliance requirement in the context of ESG and sustainability, and ultimately brand repositioning, and last but not least, cost optimization, which is always, goes back to the, financing and creating a value creation for shareholders and stakeholders. So in the last 3 decades, fortunately, I've been here in Singapore, from India to Singapore in 1998. So 25 years I spent my life here in Singapore and Asia Pacific, a little bit of EMEA and a bit of Europe and US. So what I can see that, in the current climate, right, almost, we require $30 trillion of investment, to mitigate, Paris Agreement by end of 2030. And ADB actually mentioned that almost $200 billion required for ASEAN, to address the climate change crisis. So on the contrary, there are also challenges of access to finance, right? I represent, besides all my 30 years of life in corporate. So I stepped out corporate last year, thanks to COVID. So I focus mainly with the startups and SMEs in Singapore and the ASEAN level to help them to well equipped with the changing requirements in the regional level. For example, like European Union recently announced EUDR, deforestation regulation, which address 7 commodities, which are exported to Europe, has to comply to climate change requirements, right? Deforestation requirements. So that require a lot of technology access, knowledge access, and ultimately financing access to the manufacturers here. The second one is like a CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is also from Europe. Then that address, how companies or manufacturing sector, supply chain, Mr. Lim spoke about, GCMD and, supply chain, IMO kind of stuff. So it's like, everywhere, there is a push and pull factor, right? In the context of energy transition, every country and every city is moving towards net zero. Companies are moving towards net zero, but how to achieve net zero, that's again, there are challenges here, from access to finance, access to technology, right? And of course, knowledge context. So my focus is all about, I think although 30 years being in the corporate, possibly next 30 years, my focus will be all on the community, cities, and companies. How we can help companies, cities, and communities transform and upholding new urban agenda, that is SDG 11. I'm also the convener and point of representation for UN Habitat from ASEAN, Singapore Smart City Network for ASEAN. So we try all in angle, but at the same time that, how to bring in, government, community, and corporations work together. So one of the initiatives I'm right now working on in Indonesia are accessing to the clean water, right? Because if you look at Indonesia, almost 30 million households lack of safe water. And globally, almost 5 million kids die below 5-year-old, just not having a safe water or, having a soap bar to wash their hand, right? So how to give this kind of access to the people who are in need, underprivileged? Because that's the exact, concept of, climate change, which is, affecting the vulnerable people, around the region. And particularly in ASEAN, there is a lot of coastal cities will be under the threat. I'm sure he could speak more than me from a meteorological point of view, right? There is a lot of data already indicates, how we are accelerating, and we are not seeing a deacceleration in the context of climate change based on the latest report from IPCC. So in all these contexts, right, there is a lot of opportunities. Every challenge comes with an opportunity, right? So an opportunity in the context of, how the, trade can be better off, whether it's access to energy. Like Singapore, as Mr. Ling has mentioned that, we have opened a green corridor, right, to access green electricity from region. That means it's also opportunity for job creation in the ASEAN level. While Singapore is moving towards net zero or green decarbonization. Similarly, other countries are, looking in the same context or aspect of it. So I think there is a huge push and pull will happen, and it is an opportunity for financial sector to come together, creating a better ecosystem for accessing finance so that the projects can be executed. So there is a lot of projects are there. Not to consider Singapore, because Singapore, much developed, and then we have a very strategic roadmap in achieving 2030 and 2050 goals. But if you go out of Singapore, then how that can be executed? Whether it's energy, water, waste management, infrastructure for EV, electric vehicles. I heard that a lot of people are interested in EV. We could speak about it, right? Or even for the solar adoption and green energy and transportation sector decarbonization. So there is a lot of challenges, but access to financing is one of the key. Second is actually the creating a technology or bringing a technology in affordable way, affordable cost from Europe, for example, hydrogen, right? Today's hydrogen cost of producing hydrogen is very expensive, right? How we can make access to hydrogen in an affordable way, right? On the contrary, there are a lot of opportunities in ASEAN, right? Transforming waste into hydrogen. So that means the cost of hydrogen can be economical, and instead of pursuing electric vehicle, they can even go into the hydrogen vehicle. Think about it. But enabling of technology and enabling finance and bringing the stakeholder together, which is very fundamental. And that's thing I feel that as an industry practitioner, I think there's a lot of lacking, and more countries can come together, or corporations can come together and unlock this potential. I think with this I stop, because I would like to seek a lot of questions from you guys so that I can answer. Thank you.
Okay, so my turn now. So welcome everybody. I'm really glad to be here, and I probably won't. Sorry.
I'll use that. So
Yeah. I probably won't go through my slides. So I did actually prepare a lot of slides, and I don't know whether you will see them or not separately. Yes, you'll be sent them. So for me, my background is I'm a climate scientist. So I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Climate Research Singapore. And one of our biggest projects is to actually create the next set of really high resolution climate change projections based on IPCC AR6. Because AR6 is in its first priority a global document describing what will happen globally, which is exactly what is needed. But to live in Singapore and understand what happens in Singapore, you need much more high resolution information. And so in our research institute, which is part of the National Environment Agency, we took the latest science from the sixth assessment report and did a process that's called downscaling to create really high resolution information. Initially on just the basic climate and earth system science, because any impact is based on the information of the fundamental science. And so in my department, we do both the basic fundamental science on the changes as well as the impacts of climate change. And this particular presentation there has focuses on food security, which is one of the key areas that we're looking at, because as you probably know, Singapore's imports over 90% of its food currently, but has a very ambitious plan that is called 30 by 30, that by 2030, 30% of the key fundamental food items are envisioned to be produced locally. And so, of course, and therefore, we do have to understand how is climate change affecting Singapore and food security, food production in Singapore, but even in some ways, more importantly, to understand how is climate change impacting food security in the food production countries where Singapore imports food from. And that is almost global. So therefore, the global picture is as much important as the regional and the local picture in terms of Singapore food security. And so the presentation will initially walk through some of the key IPCC Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 statements around climate change and climate change impacts. And I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, that you probably would have at least had a little look at the summary for policymaker of the latest IPCC assessment report, because these are sort of the key statements around what we see will happen, what are the choices in terms of climate change scenarios that are being discussed in the assessment report, and what we mentioned before, the Paris Agreement, which is the 1.5 to 2 degrees by the end of the century, globally averaged. At least the 1.5 looks now to be broken very soon, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But these summary for policymakers are very important documents, because that is the state of the art of the science that everybody accepted to be the state of the art of the science. So these are fallback statements for us, for anybody in the science. And so what does it say? Business as usual scenario, we will see in Singapore anywhere between a 3 and a 5 degree increase in temperature, in mean temperature. But we know that the key events that we first will see is the change in the extremes. We already have seen it over the last few decades, is how we see more extreme rainfall, more extreme temperatures. Look at the heat waves recently going around everywhere. So these are the conditions that are already been predicted in previous assessment reports that will occur more often, just as we see. So what is important for Singapore? Obviously, number one, sea level rise, as Tuan Liang mentioned before. So we need to understand really what sea level rise is doing in the future, and our centre is going to produce the latest sea level rise projections for Singapore, and the water agency in Singapore will readjust if necessary their design parameters to the coastal protection measures that they're going to build. And so we're working very, very closely with a lot of agencies in Singapore who are awaiting these new results. Particularly for food security, the question here, so what is one of the key climate drivers? These are what we call some of the big scale processes that will drive rainfall, either extremes to one side or to the other side. And so one of the things, and you probably heard about this, is the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO in short, which is has to do with the state of the temperature in the ocean in the equatorial Pacific, very far away from here, but it still impacts very greatly on our rainfall. And this is what we call a teleconnection. Something that happens over there will really modulate our rainfall here. And so how ENSO is behaving will change drought behavior and flood behavior. It has these two extreme phases that are the hot and the cold phase, and the hot phase is called El Niño and the cool phase is called La Niña. And we are just about switching into an El Niño. And this means for the region much higher risk of drought, less rainfall, higher temperatures. And this is why a lot of global centers now predict that in the next few years, because of the El Niño, we will cut through this 1.5 degree global average temperature, because El Niño is a teleconnection that is globally impactful. But for our regional food security, it is also very, very important. What will happen to El Niño in the future, and how it changes the drought behavior in the region, which we know in over Southeast Asia is very, very strongly. There are other processes that impact the rainfall variability and the future change as well. So, the system is very complex, and I keep referring the IPCC report is the key document to read about these various systems. Whereas if you go to very small countries like Singapore or the Pacific Island nation or others, you actually need a different set of data to understand this. And this is what we're doing for the ASEAN region, to provide a very high resolution set of data that will give us a much better insight into what will change how. Because for food security in Singapore, we need to understand how the rice production areas in Thailand or Vietnam or elsewhere impacted by future climate change, because Singapore is getting 95% of their rice from those two countries. So we are working in this at the moment, and we're going to keep supporting government agendas in food security in terms of the key staple products that the Singapore Food Agency needs to understand about food security and where this is going. So I might stop here, because I know this climate science angle is not the key in the discussion here in terms of trade and everything else. But just to emphasize, to understand what you're looking at, you need to have a little bit of insight into the science and what the science means. And we all know the term uncertainty in future projections is something that a lot of people grapple with in terms of why and where it comes from, what it means, and how to read it, what to do, and how to use it. And my suggestion always is talk to the climate scientists and get them to help you understand what it means, and then work together. So this is our approach. We work with everybody else together to turn the science into policies and risk understanding. So I'll probably stop here.
Thank you. And when we post the summary, we'll make sure to include the slides as an additional resource there, so you all will have access. Cesar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
Yes. Hello, my name is Cesar Jung-Harada. I'm French-Japanese, moved from Hong Kong 9 months ago, and I am associate professor at the Singapore Institute of Technology. My background is actually in the arts initially, and then in design, but now I work more in engineering and ocean science. I hope I can show some visuals. Okay. Okay, so I'm sure you know about this, but a lot of people are not aware that the ocean is one of the main control for the climate. The ocean is covering 71% of the surface of the planet, and so, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 90% of the heat of the sun ends up being trapped and redistributed into the ocean current.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And so actually Asia is going to be the most affected by climate change in terms of population, because most people are living here. 99 of the 100 cities that are going to be the most affected by climate change are in Asia. So it's interesting because most of the people are here. Most of the capitals now are starting to concentrate in this region, and most of the technology is manufactured in this region. So we have the problems, have the solution, also have capital. So I think it's very interesting to be here now. But also interestingly is that the people who are the most affected by climate change, the most vulnerable, the young people, indigenous people, are the people who are also the best protectors of this environment. Naturally, because they're living there. So if you're indigenous, you live in the forest, or you're living on a coastal area, you're completely dependent on that resource. So the people who are the most exposed are also the least rewarded by the modern mechanism of carbon credits, for example. So how do we get people who are the best protectors of the environment to be rewarded as we need them, and we need their help in this transition? So I'm going to give you a couple of projects that I worked on. So they're very specific, but I hope they're a demonstration of not only about technology, but how we bring technology to the table, not as techno-solutionism. I'm not saying that technology is going to solve everything. That's not at all what I think. But technology is definitely going to be part of the solution. So in 2010, April, the BP oil spill started. So that was one of the biggest environmental catastrophe in North America. And back then I was based in Nairobi, but the software company that's the space that I was working at was collecting crowdsourcing data about any environmental catastrophe. And so even though I was in different continents, in terms of data, I was on the front line of getting data, what was happening in the Gulf of Mexico. I was very lucky to join a team at MIT to coordinate efforts to clean up the BP oil spill. So we are designing robots to suck up the oil, if you will. And we worked for a couple of months on the topic but eventually I was getting frustrated because the technology was going to take many years to come about. It was going to be proprietary and it was going to be very expensive. So maybe the Gulf of Mexico could afford it, but let's say continuous oil spill that are happening in places like, say, Nigeria could never afford such technology. So I left my dream job, I moved to the Gulf of Mexico, and I started to help on the cleanup operation. And I started to volunteer for a non-profit organization called the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. And they are citizen scientists working to basically build cases against the oil giant, BP. So they're helping people to take pictures of the polluted site, making chemical testing, making high-resolution maps, because we, with balloons and very simple tech, to demand environmental justice, which very often was coupled with racial injustice as well. So we can see there was a lot of black people who were on the front line, managed by white people. Oil spill, the oil refineries were on the former plantation. Black workers working in the oil field and white managers. So there's a lot of like historical baggage to deal with. And so while I was working on the cleanup operation, I continued to work on some technology. And I developed with a group of citizen scientists a new type of ship, which is a shape-shifting robot. The idea is to use the power of the wind to navigate up the wind and capture the oil that is drifting down the wind. And so this project was not funded by any institution, it was crowdfunded. So it was the second scientific project on Kickstarter, not Instagram, but Kickstarter. And that allowed us to develop this technology. Now, NASA, Boeing, and MIT are working on the shape-shifting airplane wings, and they're looking at a reduction of 25% of the weight and increase of lift of 25 on airplane wings. Second project, coral reef. As you may know, coral reef, and we're going to see probably a very severe bleaching event, probably coming very soon. It's projected that 2050, 90% of the coral reef will be dead, and by 2100, 99% will be dead. Coral reef only cover 0.3%, I think, of the ocean floor, or 0.27 if I'm trying to be very technical, but they are providing 25% of ocean biodiversity. And the way that we map coral reef, as you can see on this image, is that we take either a quadrat, so it's a square, and we put it on the coral, we swim back, take another picture. It's very slow. By the time we have measured all the coral reef, they'll all be dead, basically. The time we have to measure coral reef is shrinking very, very fast. We need to understand how the coral reef are affected and what can we do to get them to survive. We need to understand which species are going to survive. Do we need to move them? Do we need to modify them? We need to do something. Otherwise, it will be a disaster for our food chain. So I also teach very young kids. So this is a one-week project. I ask middle school students to start where the other people stop. This is the state of the art. Can we do better? And so we start with design thinking, and the students will draw different ideas. One student came up with the idea that instead of a mechanical quadrat, so it's a mechanical device you put on the coral, we can project laser. We don't have to go up and down. We can basically swim over the coral, flash, 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 take pictures. We documented this and we presented it to the scientists, the top scientists in our region, and they found that it was actually a good method for measuring coral much faster and more accurately. And a year later, a master student from the University of Hong Kong, and they moved to the Science Institute of Marine Science, developed this robot, which is basically a marine drone. You can program with the GPS, and it will take thousands of pictures of coral. These are the more advanced version. The latest version can take 50,000 pictures per hour, and with AI, we can classify coral. We can identify better than most marine biologists can. And one of my students, Siddhant Gupta and Utkarsh Goel, turned this idea of using AI to classify coral, to classify plastic in the ocean. And now they have this company called Clearbot, and just a few weeks ago they were Forbes 30 under 30. And I helped them to build their prototype and raise money. More recently, in Hong Kong, maybe you know the Hong Kong, now we call it the Greater Bay. It actually used to be called the Pearl River Delta because it was full of oyster. And oyster were cleaning the ocean. But unfortunately, they have been dying very, very fast. So with my colleagues, we developed a machine to grow millions and millions of oyster very fast. It's basically a computer to optimize oyster growth. And this is the floating oyster hatchery that we built in Hong Kong 2 years ago. So the idea is to produce millions and millions of oysters in the habitat and then replant them very fast. And this is my current research. This was last year in Indonesia. I'm working with the indigenous crab farmer, and we're producing a floating solar hydrogen farm. The idea is that subsistence farmers have very low energy needs, but they're using typically kerosene and fossil fuel. We're looking at decentralizing energy production and storage of low pressure hydrogen so that they could basically have their own energy and use it for moving. So this is the machine we're going to be building this in a couple of weeks. This is going to be basically a floating laboratory for optimizing catalyst chemistry, for making non-toxic green hydrogen from Earth. So my conclusion is that the industry that everybody's talking about is AI, but the industrial revolution that we need is one that is about working with nature instead of destroying it. That's the industrial revolution that we need. And every effort, I think we should push in this direction. The challenge that we have with COVID is a very small challenge compared to the challenge that we have coming to us. And so I believe that working with open science, working with youth and indigenous people who are the best protector for the environment, women, and working on decentralized and anti-colonial technology are the key to accelerate our fight against climate change. Thank you very much.
We'll take questions now. Just a reminder to please wait for the mic and stand up and let us know who you're directing your question to.
In terms of climate extremes today, and taking the example of Singapore, which imports heavily when it comes to food. So what happens when, even along with climate extremes, the trade protectionist policies are also increasing? It's like last year we saw Indonesia, Malaysia banning the palm oil exports, and then India banning wheat, and even last week India banned the export of rice. So what happens to the countries which are heavily dependent on food when these policies come in place? Because that's the first response of most countries when they anticipate food shortages. And also how it negatively impacts the exporting countries in terms of their trade position, and what can be the way forward in this?
Thanks for the question. So you'll probably be disappointed because I'm not a trade specialist and certainly not for countries in the region. So all I can tell you is that the Singapore Food Agency has a strategy, and Chen Lang is very aware of this as well, is to diversify food sources if you're dependent on import, and this is really important, and to include the understanding of climate change impacts in the diversification. You have to know where food comes from and where you can get secure sources of food and how this is affected by climate change in the future. Now, what you're not safe against, of course, are very extreme events that are happening on very short timescales, like tropical cyclones, because you can't predict future tropical cyclones 2 years ahead. You can't. That's just not and if it destroys a whole crop somewhere, you're completely unprepared. But I guess the key here is for the countries to have a strategy around their food security that is not just dependent on single sources or a few sources. I don't know if you want to say anything on this as well.
Yeah, I think that from a country's response, the 30 by 30, for example, is a long-term response, recognizing that food security will have challenges, and particularly for Singapore, a small country that has been importing more than 90% of our food, that creates a new vulnerability. So diversification is very important. Storage of key essentials are also important. Although you can't store things perpetually, storage also requires technologies to preserve as well as space to be able to do that. But countries, I think, essentially are using these as at least the mitigating aspects of it. I think that beyond that, in the long term, is about agricultural countries looking at higher levels of climate resilience. This can come in the form of new seeds, new techniques, and even for Singapore, as we are looking at it, indoor or basically a CEA, or controlled environmental agriculture. That in some ways then preserves a certain level of resilience to maybe a portfolio or a certain segment of your food needs. So I think that's it's a combination of policy as well as looking at science to be able to look at, for example, one of our organizations have developed a much more salt-resistant rice species that then is able to it's a little bit more flood-resistant. You're actually able to grow that, and in doing so, create a food source grown with partners in which you are actually able to protect yourself to a certain extent in terms of actually climate, the changes that the climate will impose on many of our food crops.
I think it's very interesting points. Probably I think your question is very important. But I will add it in a different perspective. That so we are talking about food security and food sustainability, right? And if you look at it globally, we are almost wasting 30 to 50% of food today, right? Globally, right? While 1 billion people go to bed with no food, right? So I think it's important that every one of us to really think about it, how to reduce and repurpose the food waste. So in that context, the growing population from 8 billion today, 7.9 billion, reaching 11 billion. That means more and more food needs to surface, right? On the contrary, accelerating climate change, drought and flood, right? Both happens, whether it's Vietnam or Cambodia, you take it, where agriculture is there is no water, but non-agricultural land flooded with water. Right? I think these kind of unbalances we are going to continue to see, and then countries will take position in itself, to protect the local, right? And whether it's India or Vietnam, doesn't really matter. So as you mentioned that, self-resiliency is very important. I think every country has to really look at it, self-resiliency point of view. But on the contrary, we really need to go back to the basic that how we can reduce food waste, so that we can better use the resources what we have today. And ultimately, I think that will pan out in the context of food sustainability from every angle. Then then I think we could have a better, better environment, better food for everyone, and better quality of life.
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. I think the elephant in the room is meat consumption. So much of the meat is mobilizing so much land and so much resource and creating so much pollution. That's an obvious reason. Like, why people should starve if they could eat vegetables, if more vegetables could be made available to them. So changing what we eat, I think, is also key.
Hello, this is Komet Sohaili. I'm a freelance filmmaker and journalist based in South Korea. I have two questions about Singapore. You briefly mentioned about rising sea level, and I wonder how serious it threats Singapore considering its location, and also what practical plans you have in mind to protect Singapore. The second question is, we know that lots of lands here it's called reclaimed lands. I wonder what kind of environmental concerns Singapore has to reclaim land, both from the materials probably they import to make lands, and also for how it affects the ocean. Thank you.
Thanks. I can start off and then hand over to you. So I'll start off with the sea level rise threat mentioned, and so we know in general there is the threat of mean sea level rising, and so for example globally the projections is that it rises by 74 centimeters by the end of the century, and Singapore is actually very near that. So Singapore's average sea level rise by the end of the century is very similar to what the global sea level rise is. Now, on top of this, you have to understand that extreme sea level rise is on top, and this is produced by, say, storm surges, waves, tides, and other processes that contribute to things on top of this. So this is the average, and current design specs are calibrated to the previous information on how high this would go. So as you say, the reclaimed land, some of the is sort of calibrated to how high this goes. Now, the sixth assessment report in IPCC for the very first time provided an incredible advance in the understanding of the change in the ocean and sea level based, from 8 years ago. And so they're now providing what they call low likelihood scenarios of future change in sea level. And these low likelihood scenarios are driven by low likelihood, high impact processes. For example, the melting of the ice sheets, marine ice cliff instability, what they call them. And should these things happen, then we're looking at something that is just very different. And so what you already heard before, a lot of the heat of the sun goes into the ocean. It's the ocean that sucks in a lot of the heat. But the ocean is the process with long memory. So even if we would stop emitting right now, the ocean, the sea level rise would still happen over the next 200, 300 years, not stoppable. So there's already changes locked in by 2300 of several meters. We already know this, even if we would cut it right now. So the ocean processes are the long-term memory process that are happening. That'll happen for many, many years to come. And so for us, of course, the most of the design specs are looking 50, 80 years ahead. But we already know where some of this will go in 2300. If you add the low likelihood to this is something we couldn't possibly, fathom what this means. Singapore is an island that is low-lying. Most of the if you look at, say, a rise of 5 meters, a lot of the coastal areas are below this already. And so the Water Agency, and I'll hand over to you now, their design specs and what they're building in terms of coastal protection is going to be enormous and probably very innovative, because this is what they're looking at in terms of nature-based solutions and other things. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Aurel. And like Aurel says, actually, from a policy perspective, we depend a lot in terms of the science and how the scientists are actually informing us. So in terms of sea level today, we're looking at projecting by 2100 a 1 meter rise in terms of actually the basic sea level. But with rising tide, king tides and storm surges, that will go up to 4 to 5 meters. So then that provides a planning norm in which we begin to think about our armoring strategies. We are currently going into the initial process of designing our first seawall to the most low-lying area, which is now towards the southeastern coast of Singapore. Likely that based on the project timelines, we'll begin construction in about 2030 and be completed by 2037. But this is just one of many. Essentially, there'll be about eight separate studies on different parts of the coastline to be able to then, as I said, address the 200 kilometer coastline that we have. How low-lying are we? If we don't do anything about it, 30% of Singapore will be affected. All right, and we don't have the option of retreat, which many communities may be able to do over several decades as the sea level starts to rise. So without the option of retreat, then armoring becomes one of the key strategies as far as sea level rise is concerned. Apart from sea level rise, we also see, of course, extreme weather. Then you see rains, floods. If you're familiar with Singapore, for example, if you go to all our MRT stations, you always walk up before you go down. And that's essentially a flood barrier to ensure that the MRT entrances will always stay above whatever anticipated water levels that could be in event of a particular flood. Likewise, these planning norms are instituted across all our new developments in terms of not just the building infrastructure, but also even in actually leveling up or increasing the level of the whole land itself to avoid basically scenarios or situations of floods in Singapore when we face potentially increasing numbers of torrential rains. So I think that's the planning process, if you like, in which we work with the scientists very clearly. Why that is so is actually because it is expensive. It is expensive to bring land up. It is expensive to be able to construct additional features, right, to be able to protect against flood that may or may not happen, or at least it may not happen in, say, previously it was one in 10,000 years, now it's one in 1,000 years, and sometimes we're getting two or three of such events now within a decade. And I think that times are changing. And to that point, in terms of looking at technology, even for reclamation, we are trying out polders, basically on our Pulau Tekong polders, in which you actually do not have to reclaim land all the way to the sea level, that you're actually providing that barrier and provide active pumping of water out, so that then you actually minimize the amount of reclamation material that you are required. That is something, it's a Dutch technology, it's something that we're in the process of actually trying out, so that then we are looking at various ways and means in which we can actually reclaim land as effectively as possible. And to your point, in terms of actually environmental concerns, in terms of sources of or how we reclaim. First, in terms of actually the actual reclamation site, all of sites are closely monitored. So from an environmental impact assessment perspective, right from the initial stages of design, understanding the seabeds, the potential impact, how we actually should be designing some of our structures and land reclamation, that is well discussed, and only when the EIA, in terms of the designs, are approved, then we'll proceed. In the same way that not just at coast, but in, many of the things that we do, even for example in installation of floating solar panels on our reservoirs, we go through an extensive process in which the environmental groups are engaged, consulted, and in many ways collaborated, so that then we are actually able to work together to achieve the needs of, from a development needs perspective of a growing population, at the same time be able to then preserve the biodiversity that is being affected as well. And then ultimately, in terms of actually our reclamation source partners, we have to work very closely with them as well to ensure that the process of materials extraction is properly monitored, properly done. And so, for example, I think that more recently, Indonesia had been looking at actually being able to start the reclamation source again, because I think that over the years, after they've put a pause, they've done their own internal studies and felt that in certain areas, in certain methods, they're actually able to do that without significant impact to the environment. I think it's important that we continue to work with partners like these to ensure that we are able to meet our development needs, but at the same time not threaten the biodiversity or the environmental aspects of the partners that we work with. Thanks. Thanks for the question.
My name is Anggi. I'm from the Conversation Indonesia, and well, this is not my initial question that I want to ask, but I want to follow up Komal's question. Since we talk about the reclamation just now, I just published and edited last week an article that researched about how sand mining impact the environment. I mean, so according to the state research, a lot of villages are apparently disappeared because of sand reclamation, and there are also lots of economic, impact happening due to the reclamation. So, sorry, not the reclamation, due to the mining extraction, sand extraction. So, how do you see in mind that you can develop? Because Indonesia just opened its sand export again after like 20 years, right? So, how do you see in mind a partnership with Indonesia will be formulated given the current situation that happened? Because it's a heated debate right now, and I would be honest that that this might be far-stretched, but Indonesians or the general population are currently antagonizing Singapore, which I think is like why, I mean, this is the Indonesian government decision and it's not for Singapore anyway. So, but I'm really curious what you have in mind. And another question is about renewable energy that you mentioned earlier. So I think that we need a more elaborated effort at the regional level, because our economic development are in the Southeast Asia are not at the same level. We heard in Indonesia, we heard a lot of news about exporting renewables, exporting electricity to the Singapore, which I personally think is a good thing actually, because it means we start that Asian grid and whatever. But until now I haven't really heard any good news about this, because I think like exporting renewable energies from Indonesia, we have a lot of sources, but we don't have the capital, we don't have the technology, and I think a collaboration could help both countries to develop in certain way. But what is actually the biggest challenge to make this to achieve this goal actually, that we haven't really heard any good news?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. I'm not sure, I don't have the news from Indonesia, so I'm not sure what is the good news or the bad news. I think that to your point, it's important that while we look at sand mining, right, that the government in charge works with the local community, and of course, like I say, even with research partners, to be able to fully understand the ways and means in which you're actually able to do it. There may be some places that are completely not suitable, but yet some places that actually have reasonable opportunities to be able to do that. And I think that we want to work with the Indonesian government as much as you can to be able to understand the processes that are involved, and doing so be able to be responsible in the way that actually we are obtaining some of these resources. And of course, apart from Indonesia, I think that there are other locations, other partners who are potentially also looking at similar challenges as well, but also similar opportunities. And like I said, we will work very closely with the government as well as the sources in terms of the providers to ensure that these are done responsibly. To the point about renewable imports, I think it was either last year or the year prior that Pak Luhut, together with our senior minister Teo Chee Hean, had signed a memorandum of understanding in which there would be collaboration for the import of renewable energy. And I think that the discussions have progressed. Much of the discussions has also been looking at how we are not just importing the energy, but also providing the opportunities, working with companies to bring the capital and the technologies to allow, for example, solar PV factories to be located in different parts of Indonesia, to also build up the capacity and capabilities, such that then from a resource perspective, you are able to then do so, upgrade in terms of actually taking part in the green economy, and also have a sufficient green electrons to be able to export to Singapore. Just to provide you a context, earlier I mentioned about the limitations of having solar energy here. Our scientists have looked at about 36 square kilometers in total of all available space is all we are actually able to muster as far as Singapore is concerned. Because you must recognize that there are tall buildings, and everywhere the space in between is all actually shadow and inappropriate for solar power. But with 36 square kilometers, it generates 10% of our economy, our energy needs. So 360 square kilometers is all we need to get say 100% solar PV power. But of course, we deal with the plus and minus in terms of the irradiance and the fluctuations because of clouds. And I think that within our region, there is 360 square kilometers of spare space, or even coastal seas, right, from floating PV's perspective. I think that the challenge is about trust and understanding and collaboration, in which each community, each country has different considerations, even in actually the planning of a renewable energy source. And in doing so, we have to work very, very closely with partners to be able to make that happen. Industry has to be involved. Smart capital needs to be involved as well. If you look at it, actually, sometimes some of these things, based on location complexities, can be maybe only marginally bankable as far as these projects are concerned. And so it is with this, along this, that, for example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has been actively pushing, looks at strategies for transition financing, as well as blended finance, so that then governments can come in and de-risk some projects, so that then additional capital can come in from the traditional financial houses, the banks, to be able to then come in and structure some of these projects in a way that is commercially viable and acceptable. So there are a lot of ongoing conversations along those fronts, and I think that various agencies, various interested parties are also looking at how to identify initial projects, right, that can actually take advantage of blended finance to be able to then kickstart those projects, which up to this point, if left to the traditional banking structures, is something that the many companies were not willing to take up that risk. Yeah. So I think these are some of the challenges from my perspective.
I think probably add from a business point of view for your first question, right? Very specific to mining. I think it's important that very streamlined and structured ESG frameworks be put in place from Indonesian perspective, where Minister of Finance and Stock Exchange could drive it, so that the corporates can do the right thing, right? And I believe adding on EUDR and CBAM will ultimately help in making sure that the ecosystem of mining and underprivileged people, or mostly the workers are affected, or the tribal are affected. I think that can be taken care. But it's very important that proper ESG frameworks, guidelines, and making sure that it is really mandated. Like if you look at it from Singapore, SGX mandates very strong ESG requirement. And even after before COP26, European Union identified almost $3 trillion assets being, pegged against ESG or greenwashed. So then they brought in a TCFD principle. Then ultimately Singapore Stock Exchange, mandated TCFD as part of the all the listed companies to report, and it is a mandate. It's not voluntary from next year onwards. So I think that kind of mechanism to put in place probably will make sure that the privileges and shared values are well taken care of.
I'm Anton from the Southeast Asia Globe, and I actually had a follow-up question to Anji's point. The credibility of EIAs and ESG goals in some of the countries that supply Singapore kind of vary in credibility. Is there any procedure that the Singaporean government is working on to be able to verify what their partner governments are saying are the sources of this of these materials?
I may have to get back to you on this. I think that the main agency looking at EIA and growing that capability in terms of EIA and working with EIA partners is MPark right now, our biodiversity champion, if you like, a dedicated agency looking at that. So I may have to get back to you on that particular one. I don't hazard a guess.
Green print, if I'm correct, maybe you know more about it. You want to explain about the project Green Print? Because I don't know much about it.
And probably a little bit touch that. As you mentioned about traceability and tracking of material, there are certain initiatives run by MAS and SGX in the context of Project Greenprint. But on the contrary, as I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk, EUDR, right? Any material harvested from ASEAN, for example, anywhere in the world, export to European Union has to comply to the EUDR. So one of the key components is actually the traceability of where the material is harvested. So making sure that after 2020, it is not deforested land, for example. And beyond that, it goes to the child labor and many other aspects of it. Although it is just focused on deforestation, I believe that more and more this policy will be more agile, and they will keep changing. That it's not just harvesting, how the material is transported to another location where it's manufactured, how it's manufactured in an environmentally responsible way, right, and socially inclusive way. So all these things will be taken care. And for that, there are technologies already available in the market. For example, like a blockchain, right, which is literally helps in track and trace. Forget about crypto market of blockchain, but really the blockchain as a technology could help on properly track trace the material, how it's harvested, how it's transported, how it's manufactured, and how it's reach out to the people like you and me. So I think that will help a lot from a transparency point of view and traceability point of view. And of course, Singapore is a lot of investing on blockchain as well, separately, and to making sure that we are really protecting our interest.
Hi, this is Manas. I work for Press Trust of India, a news agency in India. So it's a broader question I want to ask to Mr. Lim, actually. So how do you see the overall issue of climate justice, particularly, I mean, the world is facing the challenge of climate finance, and as G20 president, India has been trying to build some consensus on climate finance, because I think availability of resources is not the issue. I mean, I think according to estimates, the private sector has around USD 350 trillion available now. The institutional investors and pension funds have another USD 150 trillion available, but they will not invest in markets where the risk is very high. So how do you see how to deal with the challenge of climate finance?
Thank you. Yeah. And I think that you're spot on in terms of actually looking at the risks of many of these projects, and I think that for the investors, they want to see the risk mitigated, not just in terms of percentage risk, but also about the assurance in terms of the impact that these projects are going to create. Some of these projects, if you look at the absolute definitions of green, only about 10% of the projects are actually green. 90% are all in transition, right? They do. I think, as I earlier mentioned about Asian context, a lot of Asia is still under development. There are different places and different geographies with different challenges, so they can't be, say, connected easily to an efficient grid, for example. So I think that there are ways and means in which we should look at this in a differentiated form to be able to then go, as you said, project by project, to look at what are the opportunities that we can create the project, bring the right partners and experts to make these projects bankable, viable, both operationally and commercially as well. So I think that is a lot of the challenge lies in that particular area, and it is because of that recognition that Singapore, small as we are, we are striving to look at how to develop ideas along these lines. So for example, in terms of right now, the financial markets or the banks have developed, say, the EU taxonomy for green financing. We recognize Asia, the context for Asia is also slightly different. So MAS actually working and leading several efforts to look at the Singapore-Asia taxonomy, in which we are adapting some of the assumptions, the skills that have been used to develop the EU taxonomy, but also understanding the context of Asia, and to be able to develop a taxonomy that is sufficiently credible, but also speaks to the specific context of Asia, so that green finance capital can flow into projects that have been properly assessed, which meet the mark. Many of them are more transitional projects rather than just simply pure green projects. So I think that's something that our monetary authorities are also helping to push the agenda. And we hope that more and more people, institutions and experts in Asia can come together, recognize the value of actually collaborating and bringing these this together so that then we can actually unlock the momentum of green capital coming into Asia. Thanks.
Hi, Dylan from Nikkei Asia. Anyone can answer this question. It's back to the issue of food security. I'd just like to gather your views on the prospects for the food tech frontier in this aspect. So I think Prof mentioned about maybe switching from meat consumption. So now with food tech, you can have cell-based meat without the slaughter of cows, 3D printed steaks, harvesting of fish from breeding programs in factories, increasing crop yields. So how viable are these cutting-edge food technologies in being able to continue to feed the growing population in Asia, for example? I mean, we probably understand that there's still a huge impetus for traditional agricultural methods to continue in many parts of the region, and also a huge emphasis on protecting the livelihoods of traditional farmers and livestock rearers and also crop producers. So food tech could be disruptive. It could also be a solution or part of the solution for the climate problem. But you really, how scalable is it? The cost effectiveness of it, it's pretty expensive, it seems. What do you think about the prospects for food tech in addressing the climate issue and food security?
So I think you're right at pointing out that, for example, like a cultured meat, for example, is not very scalable. If you're trying to go from a small vat to a big vat, it doesn't really scale very well, and you need a highly purified environment to do this. So it's not cost effective. So like purely cell meat culture is not really scalable in a way that could be cheaper than animal like grown on 4 legs meat. So on that, I think it's still going to be a long way until that is competitive. What I'm talking about is just not eating meat at all, or eating less of it. I understand that it's very important culturally, and it's a source of employment. So I'm not calling for like a radical, immediate changing. Everybody's got to be vegetarian. Like I'm not radical like that. But what I'm saying is that it's also recognized that it's also healthier to have a diet with less meat. And so I think one or the other, my personal view is that we will have to change our diet, whether we want it or not. And so do we make the transition on our own terms, in our own time? Or do we wait for people to starve in greater number to start to be forced to make those changes? In my opinion, it's better to make it our own turn when we can, and with a moral compass and ethics in mind, rather than being forced by starvation.
Maybe I'll just kind of add to that. I think the perspective of food tech doesn't necessarily mean only about food grown in labs. I think that to your point, actually within Asia, there's a lot of open agriculture. But actually, if you speak to the large-scale agriculture companies, in terms of actually the practices that are being used and deployed in Asia, many of them are not necessarily very, very productive. Excessive use of fertilizers, say for example, even in aquaculture, rather than using pelleted feed, to just use all sorts of different kind of food, right? Thrown into the ocean, much of it is not eaten by the fish. It sinks to the bottom. It starts to decompose. Actually, basically, it starts to contaminate the waters. Or to the next level, rather than just vertical farms, there are also greenhouses to be able to then control and better control the environment in which the food is grown. Other techniques like regenerative farming, right? There are a bunch of things that I think that from a technology and application perspective, we can actually improve the processes that are used in agriculture in Asia. So I don't think that we should think about the very more expensive ones. If I must say that particularly in Singapore, it's a little bit more unique because we are indeed land scarce. So we have to think of ways in which we have the indoor farming, we have rooftop farming, greenhouse farming as well, to be able to bring that combination to make it a viable portfolio. But I think that in many parts of Asia, the ability, I think, for new technologies to improve open agriculture is there, and we should really help the industry to be able to understand that and adopt better practices.
I think very interesting point you brought up. I think that, I had to tell you this story. It has to go away from the lab. There is a nature environment you can do better. And there are already happening, if you look at it, almost 25% of carbon emission is from agriculture, food and forestry, right, globally. The latest technology used in agriculture farming, to reduce pesticide, water, the way how the water being used, right, that actually reduced the overall methane production, right? So methane, 1 kg of methane equal to 28 kg of carbon dioxide, right? So the lower the methane is, better for the ambient. So many countries, including India, I know a few projects already happening, engaging thousands of farmers in a better way to do the agriculture farming. Through that, the reduction of methane being captured as a carbon credit, and enabling carbon credit, at least 1/3 of the monetization of the carbon credit goes back to the farmer. So these are some good stuffs are happening, where Vera and Gold Standards are engaged. At least I know one project in Hyderabad, they are working on it. So that could benefit at least 100,000 farmers. So I think where technology like a blockchain comes in, Digitex comes in, everything come together in enabling that. So hopefully such cases can be scaled up and grown into every section of the cities and countries. I think that will solve the food problem. And while we continue to be more responsible.
Okay. So I'm Jamil. I'm from Vietnam, covering Vietnam market for Singapore's the Business Times. So this question is for Mr. Jung-Harada. I saw that you share a lot of interesting technology projects related to tackle environmental problem. So my question is, so actually when I talk with agricultural tech startup, and they say that the main problem that they face it's really hard to change the long-standing practice of farmers, just like what the panelists have just said. So do you face that kind of challenge when you work with indigenous people in some of your projects, and what are your solutions? The second question is that since you say that it's important to work closely with indigenous people to implement those projects, is it possible to scale this kind of effective technology, solutions, not only within that country, but also to in other countries like in ASEAN that facing the same challenge? Like, is it possible to scale up quickly those kind of solutions, or it still take a lot of time? Yeah, so that's my question.
Thank you very much. So I think you're perfectly right. When you're working with the indigenous population that may not be very connected to the internet, for example, where sometimes they are, but sometimes it's also a matter of culture, and they don't necessarily want to change it. It's part of their lifestyle, their habits, and I think you can tip the balance. For example, like, let's say if they see that their fishery stock are falling down, and they would tell me, well, I don't need to measure fish in the scientific way. I can just put my head on the water and I can see if the fish is here. But then if you help them to go through the data and explain them about the projection and modeling, and they can see that, okay, in the future, your child will not have water, will have no fish, for example, if you continue to fish in this way, then they will start to think in a different way. So I think if you have the time dimension and you have family dimension, and if you tell them that if they want to keep the tradition alive, they actually have to, for example, reduce or change their stuff. It becomes difficult when, for example, certain fisheries, they are in a race against time. They would say, if I don't fish, well, the other boats are going to come anyway, and they're going to kill the fish anyway. So that's when it becomes difficult, because it becomes then geopolitical. And so then the conversation is almost impossible, right? Because then it's a zero-sum game. Somebody's going to take it, might as well be me. So right now, I would say that's the difficulty. You feel that the walls are closing in, and everybody's just taking as much as they can until it's too late. So I wish I knew the answer how to change the logic. I don't. In terms of replication, I have some hopes that we can propose a business model that is focused on bringing riches, revenue, to the user. If we decentralize energy production, if we make this technology really open source, then hopefully we can see the emergence of smaller industry that have in the interest not to destroy their own environment because they're going to stay in the same environment. So I think by changing the economic model and changing the incentive cycle, I think we can get there. But again, it's going to be within the picture of like a broader trend. For example, like if you're in an area where oysters are dying because of climate change, how are you going to be making long-term plans for improving the stock of oysters in your area? So yeah, having mobility, I think, is going to be increasingly important for a lot of those cultures. I could see like mobile farms. In the ocean, it's a bit different than on land. On land, you cannot really move. On the ocean, we can move. And naturally, animals are already doing those migrations. So I think people will have to move. They will migrate with the algae that they're growing. They will going to migrate with the fish that they're growing. So that's what I'm expecting. I see a very different infrastructure in the future.
I think based on my experience, right, working on the ground, I think it's important that we don't tell what needs to be done, but we empower them how to do it. Then things are changed, and they are part of the problem solving. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So stakeholder engagement is very, very important, from a grassroots level all the way to the government level.
Just a small connection to what I earlier mentioned. Singapore International Agriculture Week, one of the things that we convened, and that's where I met a Vietnamese technologist who has deployed, his design in terms of actually prawn farms, right? In which his model, he is JV with the local farmers, in which he is actually able to share the profits. But at the same time, he's got a system that is incredible. He's able to, from his phone, monitor all various farms. They're able to submit the water quality readings. His AI is able to assess and make decisions and recommendations on the kind of things that they needed to do. He's implemented different kind of blue, red lighting to be able to encourage the shrimp to molt and feed in different ways. And then he's got a system of flowing the waste to tilapia, which then naturally eat up the rest of the food waste, and has in doing so created a very circular system in which he has hoped to be able to spread to different farms across Vietnam. So I think that the technologies are exciting. The ability for us to, I think, to bring that message out for journalists to be able to also cover these and spread the word is that we're optimistic, but we need to get the word out there faster.
Thank you. And I know that there's a few more questions, but I'm hoping that you all can follow up by email or come up now and share your cards. I do want to be respectful of your lunch break. So thank you all for joining us. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.